Good afternoon. My name is Erwin Chemerinsky, and I have the enormous pleasure of being the Dean of Berkeley Law. February is Black History Month. In connection with this, the law school's staff circle on anti-racism proposed a panel issue of reparations. Delighted that we have 5 terrific speakers today to discuss this great topic. I'm very grateful to the staff circle on anti-racism, and especially to Thembi Ann Jackson for all of their work in helping to put together the panel, and to Jenny Boyden, as always, for handling all of the logistics so well. California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Assembly Bill 3121 in September 2020, establishing a first-in-the-country task force to study and make recommendations with regard to reparations for slavery. The passing of AB 3121 has prompted new discussions in California and around the country on the issue of reparations, including their role in the ongoing struggle for racial justice, policy implications, and also methods of implementation. And it's all of that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. As I alluded to, we have 5 terrific speakers. I'm very grateful to each of them for taking time from a busy schedule to be part of this conversation this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to be speaking. We'll hear from each of them in turn, and then we'll have time for whatever questions you want to send in. I apologize, as I always do, to the speakers. I'm going to do very short bios because I know the audience wants to spend its time listening to you and not hearing me. The first speaker will be Charles Henry. He's Professor Emeritus of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley. Holds a PhD in political science. He's the author of Long Overdue, The Politics of Racial Reparations. He's a past president of the National Council for Black Studies and a former board chair of Amnesty International USA. The second speaker was Jovan Scott Lewis. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Berkeley. He's the author of Scammer's Yard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica, in which he examines crime from a novel reparations framework. In his forthcoming book, Violent Utopia, he further analyzes the possibilities for repair and the geographies of freedom through a study of Black life in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Our third speaker will be Cecilia Cissell Lucas. She teaches global poverty practice minor, the Interdisciplinary Social Science program, and also a course on art activism through the Big Ideas Courses program. Her research is on the potential and pitfall of white people's involvement in racial justice and decolonization processes, and it sits very much at the intersection of critical race studies, performance studies, and education. Our fourth speaker, Michael Ralph. He teaches in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis in the School of Medicine at New York University. His research integrates political science, economics, history, and medical anthropology through an explicit focus on debt, slavery, insurance, forensics, and incarceration. His 2015 book, published by the University of Chicago Press, Forensics Capital, examines how the Senegalese people determine who owns what in daily interaction in geopolitics. He's currently at work on 2 books that's on slavery, insurance, and incarceration. And our final speaker will be my colleague, John Paul, who's professor at Berkeley Law. He's also the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute here at Berkeley. He's professor also in African American and Ethnic Studies here at UC Berkeley. He was previously executive director of the Kerwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University, and prior to that, the founder of the Institute of Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. Before that, he was the legal director of the National American Civil Liberties Union, and that's where John and I first met each other. I guess I should say over 35 years ago, but then I should say we were both in middle school then, right, John, when we met 35 years ago? With that, I will turn it over to Professor Henry, and we'll hear from each of the speakers in order, and then we'll have questions and answers.
Thank you. In the mid-1970s, I co-authored an article entitled Imagining a Future in America. And the theme of the article was the absence of Blacks in utopian literature. in short, how can we move from here to the future if we can't imagine a future of racial equality? And the article was stimulated by a book that came out in 1975 called Ecotopia by Ernest Callenbach. And Ernest Callenbach's book, which was influential on the Green movement and the countercultural movement, imagined Northern California, Oregon, and Washington seceding from the United States. And it took place in the year 1999, at that point, far into the future. And, you know, it was a utopian society from the point of the environment. It was led by women in major positions. Marijuana was legal. Small business ownership was important. Sustainable economic development was important. It had all of those things that we think about as progressive going for it, except African Americans lived by themselves and separated from this ecotopia in the East Bay, Oakland, California, I assume. There's no explanation as to why Blacks withdrew from this ecotopia. Well, it prompted my co-author and I to look at utopian literature, and we went back and looked at things like the Blythedale Romance by Hawthorne, which talks about and grows from the commune experience and talks about women's rights. It's written in 1852, essentially on the eve of the Civil War, and says nothing about slavery and what's happening in terms of race in the United States. We looked at Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, written in 1888. And it's essentially talking about a socialist utopia. It talks about labor rights. It's the third most popular book written in the 19th century, and Blacks are totally absent from it. It's at the end of Reconstruction when redemption and Jim Crow are being established, and there's no discussion. So the fiction kind of mirrors the reality in terms of the fact that no mainstream American political leader for most of our history imagines a future of Blacks and whites together in racial equality in America. That, of course, includes Lincoln, who right up through the middle of the Civil War is hoping they might find a place in Haiti or Liberia for the slaves that would be freed. One of the reasons that Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is so popular on both liberal and conservative sides is because it's so rare. Talking about little Black children and white children holding hands and walking forward together is rare in terms of major leadership in this country. Most recently, ex-Donald Trump's 1776 commission applauds Martin Luther King for his vision, and then in the next paragraph attacks affirmative action, which was one of Martin Luther King's techniques for getting to that dream. So all of this to me brings up the question of repair or reparation. And let me quote James Baldwin, one of my favorite authors. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. Now with that, I'll move to the first slide. I want to talk about sort of three aspects of the reparations movement. And I just have time to mention a couple of things about each slide. And of course, you can come back and ask me questions in the question and answer session if we have the opportunity. And the first slide talks about reparations cycles. And I think at various points in our history, when we've been willing to talk at all about reparations, each period has some characteristics. And the immediate post-Civil War period, the emphasis is on land and a land base for the newly freed men and women. As Du Bois said, Russian serfs have gotten more than African-American slaves from their countries. And of course, the most famous effort to provide some land base for ex-slaves was Sherman's Field Order 15, which talked about 40 acres and a mule for a black family or 10 acres for an individual. That very brief experiment ended when President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, in 1868, pardoned all ex-Confederates and returned their land to them. I want to point out, usually not discussed in that time period, but the Homestead Acts were published at the same period. 1862 is the first one, 1866, and there are subsequent ones. But in those first two Homestead Acts, in the middle of the Civil War and just after, 246 million acres of land are given to pretty much white Americans. And today, 46 million adult Americans have descendants who benefited from that land. It was essentially 10% of America's land base. At the turn of the century, this focus shifted from land to pensions, because we have reached the point that there are a number of elderly ex-slaves with no source of income, many having lived through the sharecropping system. And the United States government had passed reparations for Union Army veterans of the Civil War on very generous terms. Incidentally, there was also a movement for the federal government to pay Confederate Army veterans pensions. And there was a major effort, and there were a number of ex-slave pension societies, the largest led by Callie House, among others, calling for pensions for ex-slaves. That didn't happen. Then we moved to the mid-20th century, and the momentum generated by the civil rights movement and Black Power. We hear Martin Luther King talking about insufficient funds and economic rights and a Marshall Bill of Rights, or Marshall Plan for the Negro. We see the Black Power movement in the form of the Nation of Islam and the Republic of New Africa talking about a land base for African Americans. We see a shift to private demands on private entities, non-governmental entities like James Foreman's Black Manifesto, which is asking the Black church community for reparations. And then we have the contemporary period. And I cite that period as beginning with the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided reparations for Japanese Americans who had been interned by this country during World War II. That sparks John Conyers' bill, H.R. 40, which was presented to Congress, the Study Commission in 1989, and finally had hearings in 2019. Could I have slide 2, please? And slide 2, and one of the things I didn't say just on the last slide was the beginning of a number of legal cases, but there are two real major strategies in terms of reparations. One's legal and one's legislative. The legal strategy has had a number of obstacles that can be summarized as the 3 S's: sovereign immunity. Governments tend to be immune from lawsuits. You have to gain their permission to sue them, which has happened. Standing, you have to be personally harmed in order to bring the case to court, and statute of limitations. There are limitations on some of the crimes that are talked about, and other incidents were not considered crimes at the time, i.e. slavery being legal in the United States. So a number of communities, both national, state, and local, have preferred the legislative strategy. And in my book, I look at 2 in particular: Rosewood, Florida, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. arguing that that there are a number of similarities in those cases, but there was success in Rosewood in gaining some reparations. It's not been success in Tulsa, and I think the cases are similar. I mentioned the similarities in terms of time, the early 20s, place, the resistance, the lost prosperity, blacks being driven out of town, the role of the press, the deaths, the erasure of these issues from the historical record. But I argue that Rosewood was successful for two or three things that we have to think about in terms of successful legal case or legislative cases. One was that Florida had a mechanism to handle disputes from people who had been impacted by governmental action and couldn't get around sovereign immunity. They had an ombudsperson, and so the Rosewood claims went into that mechanism. It was a mechanism that handled that sort of thing. Secondly, they had a lobby and they had a survivors group. They had a congressional Black caucus in Florida and a lobbying and an organized survivors group that wasn't present in Tulsa. And there was more white opposition in Oklahoma. And I actually considered the Oklahoma case a stronger case because of the more extensive involvement of the government in the 60 to 300 lives lost in Tulsa. A mass grave was recently discovered in Tulsa. Let me go on, because I've got 1 or 2 minutes left to talk about slide 3. And that's sort of some contemporary things that are happening. There's been a shift of public opinion. I think we might now be in another cycle of reparations. I think part of that is due to the overt white nationalism of the Trump administration and the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement on the quite obvious racial injustice in the United States. So one measure of that shifting public opinion would be the presidential campaigns. In 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, Democratic candidates are running away from the reparations issue. They're saying things like, well, it's a worthy issue, it's an important issue, we can't deal with it now. Obama puts it in the very narrow context of slavery, saying it's something that's not going to happen. What happens this past presidential campaign, every Democratic candidate has something to say about reparations. Biden didn't have the most progressive position, but he did endorse a study commission on reparations. So it's an issue that's being talked about now. The last thing I would say is that much of the discussion focuses around economics and financial payments. There are also other kinds of reparations, and you can see in this list, for example, the repatriation of art stolen from Africa by the Dutch and French governments. Colleges who had benefited from slavery offering scholarships to and money for study centers to descendants. The creation of museums like the National African American Culture Museum in Washington, or the Montgomery Museum Memorial of Bryan Stevenson, or the new Mississippi or Atlanta museums. So those are important forms of reparations that help to heal and begin the discussion. And as mentioned in the opening by the dean, we have a new California law. A study commission will be put together. The law was pushed forward by Shirley Weber, a professor of African American Studies at in San Diego, and the new Secretary of State. So I'll stop with that, and I'll welcome your questions in Q&A. Thanks.
All right, so Charles, thank you so much for that. You continue to be an inspiration in the work that I do around some of these questions, and in particular, now that I've turned my attention towards Oklahoma, thinking back to the moment of Indian Territory. But the discussion that I want to have today, it takes us to Jamaica, and it's an important move, I think, because it's important to remember that, the transatlantic slave trade was one of our earliest instantiations of what we now would call or identify as globalization. And so the claim of reparations and the issue of reparations needs to also be seen within this kind of global context, and not, parochialized, if as it were, on the basis of the nation state. So I want to start with the liberalization of Jamaica's telecommunications industry. This is at the turn of the century, and it spurred the development of the country's call center industry, providing data and customer care services for mostly North American companies such as Amazon. The call centers would quickly compete with the historical tourist industry as scores of young Jamaicans vied for these white-collar jobs. But low wages and high attrition would come to characterize call center work, but within those circumstances, a new opportunity would present itself. With access to the contact details of thousands of US-based customers and having learned the art of customer service, the Jamaican lottery scam, as it would come to be called, would prove the industry to be profitable after all. The scam would ultimately become a radical means of accumulation as scammers targeted vulnerable white American senior citizens, promising them various awards from cash to cars. But like the young men I discussed in my book, Scammer's Yard, some scammer crews use a sophisticated form of credit relations, telling their victims that they had been overcharged through a miscalculation of the credit card's APR. So to receive the refund of that miscalculation and the overpayment, they would have to pay a processing fee. Scammers collected these fees through money transfer service providers on the island, such as Western Union and MoneyGram. Working with these crews, which in particular, the one that I worked with was comprised of 3 young and poor men, I wanted to understand the moral framework by which they could justify and make sense of their participation in the scam. I have to admit that I was surprised when, as they were then inspired by a popular song, this is back in 2012, they argued that the fraud was a form of reparations. The crew's reparative justification was, immediately, and I think quite obviously, very convenient. However, given that they could articulate a reparative rationale, I felt compelled to take the justification seriously. For the crew, the reparations they claimed from their victims had very little to do with the normative principles on which reparations are commonly based. Rather than situating reparations within an argument about slavery, they viewed reparations as an explicitly contemporary concern. The contemporary poverty that they experienced was ultimately more meaningful and identifiable than the injury of slavery. In this way, the crew departed from the global question of reparations that was taking place across the formerly colonized world. And this includes the United States. The scammer claim did much disrupt the usual discursive hindrances to reparative claims, namely recognizing the deserving victims and critically identifying complicit and guilty parties. Pardon me, I'm getting all kinds of messages here. Okay, pardon me. So in taking this approach, scammers engage in a politics of refusal, that recognizes the unattractiveness, if not expiration, of the old options of liberal progressiveness out of which predominant reparative frameworks are born. The refusal is paired with a form of self-fashioning produced by vernacular articulations that resist liberatory ethics. This move frees the scammers from being bound by liberal respective representation or politics. Moreover, the scammer and his claim can expand beyond the respectability underpinning the reparative frameworks and proposals from reparations leaders and programs. Refusal makes possible a temporal shift away from the history of slavery to poverty's contemporary experience. The scam's reparative formulary is radical because it mobilizes a reparative logic that's capable of reformulating the sites and perpetrators of post-colonial transgression in a manner that stretches and bends the conventional history of colonial exploitation. The reformulation, as they have it, is possible explicitly because of the spatial and racial negotiations of scammer recognition. So when answering my question of how they could think that scamming North Americans could pay the reparative debts earned by centuries of British slavery, and of the colonialism that would follow, one member of the crew that I worked with replied in response with a question of his own, in which he asked me, but aren't they the same white people? So during the reconfiguration of time as a reparative marker, this crew member had brought up something unexpected but unmistakable. Indeed, the whites in Britain and the whites in America were the same kind of white people, especially if we overgeneralize the kind of Anglo influence in the United States and its formation, especially cultural and political formations. Still, they were different because of their colonial pasts. Again, it was the British who enslaved, Black Jamaicans, as we normatively understand the process. But what the crew member was doing by lumping together both the British and Americans together was a semiotic maneuvering that accounted for a long history of Jamaican experience where the British and then the Americans functioned in the same capacity. If the British once had Jamaicans work the plantations, the Americans now had them working in the hotels and call centers that trapped them in the continued cycle of poverty that in many ways linked back to the plantation. This logic of white fungibility then shifted the burden of proof away from Black subjects who needed to provide evidence of their injury, and instead placed that burden on whites to disprove their legacy of inducing harm. Rather than Black people needing to reconcile with the inheritance of injury, whites needed to reconcile their history and inheritance of this harm. This move opened up the scope of culpability, right? And it upended the troubling calculation in which, for example, the United States owed African Americans and the United Kingdom owed Anglophone Caribbean Blacks, which only serves to reinscribe a kind of colonial property logic back onto Black subjects in each geographic context. But also beyond that, to the scammers, the United States held the most viable, accessible, and profitable means, right, of actually quantifying and identifying what could be seen as the material aspects of repair. Again, through refusal, the crew radically redefined the normative geographic delimitations of reparative blame, and in the process uncovered or at least made more apparent the true interconnected and globally conspiratorial crime of Western development. In other words, there was not just one guilty party, it was every party that participated and then benefited from their current poverty and the system that produced it. The rationale is a demonstration of the disjuncture between the misery and hardship of Jamaicans' lives as they experienced them on the island and the imagined experience of the material well-being of America. So the scammers produced an accounting, really, that skipped across time and geography to transform Britain's transgression into the United States. Right? And it's a genealogy that can actually be traced through the post-colonial custodianship of Jamaican exploitation, which has changed hands over the decades with the reorientation of British-Jamaican trade and political relations to that of Jamaica and the United States. As a result, scammers explode the geographic remit of injury and responsibility to offer novel and capacious terms of transgression. The mobility of transgression is made possible by their sophisticated capacity to trace colonial debt through whiteness, both across time and space. So the reparative debt, and specifically its mobility, is made apprehensible because of the debt's core racial capitalist foundation in whiteness. This whiteness, the kind that is the same between British colonials and middle-class North Americans, the ones that scammers are targeting, serves as a mode or a function of inequality, and therefore offers a steady marker of blame across its permutations and exchanges. In other words, the debt can move. There's a mobility behind the ability of identifying guilty parties. The transferability of this debt is facilitated by whiteness's operation as an object is overrepresented. In other words, white supremacy and its ordering of the world effectively makes the blame broad. Therefore, the white Western project's geographic scale and scope, right, have meant that its overrepresentation can be manipulated wherever it is most vulnerable. This is the sophistication of the scammer's reparative project, and where it succeeds, to use a kind of generous term, compared to where most conventional reparations programs fail. But for the scammer logic, which recognizes the subjective flattening that makes racialization possible, the white state is no different or less complicit than the state's white subjects. And here's where the convenience of the scammer notion of repair demonstrates its potential. So with this approach, the scam broadens the ability for claims to be made at a growing scale, charted along a kind of tangled path of relations, made through globalization and the compounding of injustices carried forward by neoliberal economic policy. In other words, as we continue to encounter and to reckon with the growing scale of anti-Blackness across the world, what these moments do is they add to the reparative debt. This move remedies, in many ways, the full depths of the colonial injury by recognizing, or through its recognition of, through the fungibility of whiteness. Using that fungibility then rearticulates whiteness as a modality capable of carrying blame and holding it in sites that facilitate the most accessible claim making for repair. Fungible repair reconfigures the basis for repayment on the terms most suitable for those who are making the claim. Other more conventional programs for reparation are hampered both materially, but more importantly, discursively, by fixed ideas of blame, which are rooted in a morality that is primarily the making of the colonial powers to whom they owe their injury. But with the deft shifting of blame, scammers manipulate to relocation discharge. Their practice, therefore, eschews the need to be made right by the assertion and the acceptance of colonial wrongdoing. So to conclude, admittedly set against the kind of broader movement for reparations, which many of us are going to discuss today, which has over the past couple of years seen, growing political recognition, the scammer framework is one that would very unlikely qualify as legitimate. However, my point has been neither to legitimize the scammer rationale nor to endorse the criminal modality by which it is executed. The power and value of the scammer claim, however convenient, is that among the various reparations frameworks, it is the specific and personal ideals that make up the experience of living in the everyday wake of injury. Moreover, emancipated from the expectations of both respectability and collectivity, the scammer reconfigures a sense of repair as a direct and undiluted satisfaction of those who carry the reparative blame. And so through this reconfiguration, scammers upend the conventional relations between North Atlantic powers by eschewing any expectation for mutuality, recognizing that the world as it is by design will really never function in terms of equality. And so thus, if not formally so, reparations must be taken by whatever means, as long as those means satisfy their pursuits, which unapologetically for these scammers qualify as repair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles and Jovan. I'm going to focus my remarks on why I believe it's also essential to engage in reparations processes at the local community scale, and why reparations is the approach I advocate for most strongly with white people who want to contribute to racial justice work. Back in 1857, Frederick Douglass already made the succinct point that power concedes nothing without a demand. And this is particularly true when it comes to demands that would impact those in power in a material way. As Charles already mentioned, even those 40 acres and a mule that were promised to formerly enslaved people were never provided. Instead, the government paid many former slave owners reparations for government seizure of private property. And as Martin Luther King argued back in 1967, quote, "Justice so long deferred has accumulated interest, and its cost for the society will be substantial in financial as well as human terms. Most of the gains of the past were obtained at bargain rates. The desegregation of public facilities cost nothing, neither did the election and appointment of a few Black public officials," end quote. Fast forward to last year, when in July, the City Council of Asheville, North Carolina made national headlines for voting unanimously to grant reparations to Black residents. But then in November, the vote on the financial aspect of the resolution needed to begin actually implementing it was pulled from the council agenda and has not yet reappeared. Considering that HR 40, which only seeks to study the issue of reparations, has been unsuccessfully brought before Congress every year since 1989, it's certainly a step forward that the state of California and some cities have committed to studying the issue, and in some cases have even funded certain efforts. But the snail's pace of governmental action, as well as a long history of broken promises and symbolic concessions without material impact, means that if we want to see real progress on the issue, we need to start implementing it ourselves at the community level. Some argue that's letting the government and corporations off the hook, and there's several points I would make in response to that. First, taking whatever actions can be taken at the local level now doesn't mean giving up on also pressuring the government and corporations. Second, as Fabiana Rodriguez has pointed out, cultural change generally precedes political change. And we can see that on the topic of reparations too. The traction it's gained in recent history has arguably been because of things like the publication of Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay, The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic, and because of the movement for Black Lives' creation of a reparations toolkit, and there and other activists and artists and writers normalizing reparations discussions, experimenting with reparations processes, and putting the topic into greater and greater circulation. And the more we continue to do this, the more we create the terrain upon which more meaningful legislative changes become possible. Third, theories of visionary organizing, as articulated by Grace Lee Boggs and pursued by many of the current prison and policing abolitionists, aim to supplant oppressive institutions and structures not only via protest, civil disobedience, and/or violent overthrow, but by making them obsolete through the development of more desirable alternatives. And we can be building and proliferating these alternatives through the money and other resources that we move towards them at the community level. And finally, we simply can't afford to wait for governmental action on this issue. And when I say we here, I do mean all of us, because white people's liberation is also dependent on reparations. James Baldwin poignantly laid out what's at stake when he declared that the fact that white people have not yet been able to face our history hideously menaces this country and the entire world. The word reparations itself, as well as its practice, carries powerful potential to intervene in the understanding of this history. For example, the words aid, helping, giving, welfare, charity, handouts, donations, development, philanthropy, all of these words, when used by white people and white institutions to describe their actions, silence the exploitation that enabled the capacity to give through accumulation by dispossession, aka stealing. Worse, these words imply altruism, generosity, responsibility for one's fellow human being, and the users of these words frequently expect recognition and gratitude, adding insult to injury. And this isn't just semantics. How we think about our actions informs how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. And one of the biggest hindrances to the dismantling of white supremacy is the entitlement complexes of white people who believe that we deserve the places we inhabit, the geographical places, the economic places, and the places of status and power. Bayo Komolafe talks about how we have never left the slave ship, that in many ways our society is still built upon its logic, and that we need to be careful about making demands that are focused on justice if justice is understood to be primarily about getting a fair piece of a poisonous pie, about being fully included in a fundamentally terroristic system. So when it comes to the potential of reparations to push forward a liberatory process, we have to also be clear about what we mean when we use the term. As Robin D.G. Kelly stated, quote, "Without at least a rudimentary critique of the capitalist culture that consumes us, even reparations can have disastrous consequences. Imagine if reparations were treated as startup capital for Black entrepreneurs who merely want to mirror the dominant society. What would really change?" End quote. Or in the words of the Reverend Lanice Pinkard, quote, "Viable reparations has to privilege systemic change and be simultaneous with helping people change ideologically, putting restrictions on how the money can be used so that the broadest possible flourishing happens, the capacity to flourish in the largest possible sense of community. What was lost was collective. The issue isn't access to opportunity, but to relationality, life, joy, sustenance, education for liberation of body, mind, and spirit," end quote. And this, I would argue, is just as true for white people. Our very selves are dependent upon our relations with others. When these relations are defined by domination, however, we become oppressors and love becomes impossible. If this pandemic teaches us anything at all in this hyper-individualistic nation, I hope it is a more visceral understanding of how intractably interconnected we are, that our fates are tied up in one another. And thus, reparations should be experienced by white people not as punishment and not even simply as justice, but as movement into our own liberation. I like to use the term preparations in that academic-y way we have of putting slashes in the middle of words, P/reparations, to place the focus on dealing with the ways in which the past is impacting the present so that we might prepare for a more liberatory future. Because there is no pristine past to return to, and how could the debts of lives slaughtered, enslaved, dispossessed, raped, incarcerated, and dehumanized ever be repaid? That's impossible. But we can do what is needed to attempt to heal and to ensure that the same patterns don't continue. Reparations are a set of open-ended processes which include apologies, material redress, cultural and educational redress, and policies to ensure non-recurrence of harm. And of course, seriously pursuing any of this also requires deep internal work, some might say spiritual work, at the individual, interpersonal, and community levels. As for the governmental level, we could generate the funds for the material redress component by taking money out of policing, prisons, and the military and instituting a wealth tax to cap the amount of wealth anyone can accumulate. In doing so, we're then also contributing to the process of transforming those structures and institutions that are recreating similar harms under different auspices. In the meantime, though, there is much we can also be doing at the community level, and I'm going to end by sharing just a few examples of efforts that recognize that reparations is not just about money, but must also include this component. And I've put links to where you can learn more about these examples on slides that I'll share about each of them. So the Reparations Procession is a project that happened in the Bay Area last year, in which an anonymous group of white people walked in mourners' clothing and veils every day for 40 days and raised money that was passed on to two local organizations, Black Solidarity Fund and Segurite Land Trust. Buy Back Black Debt is a project created by Sonia Renee Taylor, in which white people who have spiritual debts are matched up with Black people who have financial debts, and both forms of debt are worked on as white people pay down Black people's financial debts. The Bank of Community Reparations is an initiative that was launched by Lisa Tiny Gray Garcia as a mechanism for those who have access to hoarded wealth to redistribute it. Money from the bank is used to provide housing, vehicles, diapers, food, utilities, healthcare, et cetera, to poor people. And while this initiative is not specifically focused only on Black people, because of the racialized nature of the wealth divide, Black people are highly represented among the recipients of these funds, and a very interesting multiracial coalition has been built in the process. And those contributing to the bank are asked to reflect on and write about how they came to have access to these resources and why they are reparating them. And then some white people, including myself, who, recognizing that inherited intergenerational wealth is a cornerstone of the continuing wealth divide, have passed on any inheritance received as reparations. This kind of practice could get formalized into a more widespread campaign in which white people pledge to do this and enter into accountability relationships around following through. In general, I think the thing to always be asking ourselves is what's possible from where I'm currently located. So given that this panel is being put on by the law school, I'm curious about what the law school itself can do on this front. How about providing free tuition, room and board to Black students? How's the law school engaged in the current struggles related to the role of the university in gentrification and the displacement of Black people? Or how might the law school materially support the grassroots leaders who are doing reparations work right now? What suddenly becomes possible when this is deemed a high enough priority to put our money where our mouths are? I've quoted a lot of people in this short talk because I think it's important, especially for white people speaking on these issues, to not act like we made these insights up, but to name our teachers and influences. So deep bows of gratitude to all those who have taught me, especially my Black teachers, and especially those centered in disability justice, which is a framework developed by disabled, mostly queer Black people and people of color, which brings an intersectional lens to bear on the creation of hierarchies of human worth. And I'll end with one final slide with a link to learn more about that. And just say that my hope is that as we continue to engage with reparations processes, possibilities will emerge that may be beyond what we can imagine right now. And it will be messy and complicated and imperfect with no guarantees of outcomes, but we owe it to ourselves and each other to keep trying. So, thank you.
I want to thank my fellow panelists, and it's an honor to speak on this panel alongside you. And I want to build on your insights. I want to begin though by acknowledging the land of Lenape people where I live and teach at New York University. If anything, I think reparations sort of reveals the predicament of what it means to be stolen people on stolen land, and I want us not to lose sight of that. I'm going to organize my comments toward thinking of reparations and the kind of methodological concerns, like how we might approach conceptualizing reparations as part of this effort that my panelists are helping to articulate, and how we might deliver on this deserved claim for reparations. And I sort of want to begin by noting that I've been doing research on the history of capital in relation to slavery and insurance. And in particular, I built a website, treasuryofwearysouls.com, which shows the range of enslaved people who were rented and insured, and the value of policies held by insurance companies that exist even today, like New York Life Insurance, AIG, and Aetna. And the way that slavery worked in terms of insurance is that after the slave trade to the U.S. ended in 1808, after it was outlawed, but slavery was still legal in the U.S. until 1865, obviously. So people who wanted enslaved workers in large numbers could not bring them in. So they had to either sort of kidnap people and sell them into slavery, breed them, which took attention to the life cycle and took a long time, or they could rent them from people who had enslaved people in abundance. And the market in insuring enslaved people and renting them became so big that ultimately you could say like three different sort of distinct categories of enslaved people who were rented out. And as they were rented out, they were insured because their owners didn't want to lose the value of that property when they were in someone else's possession. So those enslaved people were usually bureaucrats, like people who ran households or were drivers or clerks. They worked in very dangerous or very lucrative industries like railroads, steamboats, coal mines, or they were artisans like cobblers, blacksmiths, things like that. So in Treasury of Weary Souls, there's more than 1,300 entries of enslaved people who were rented out. When they rented out, they were insured. It talks about their owners, their names, their occupations, where they lived and worked. And I mention this because that data that I built on to build the site and to do research on slavery and insurance actually came to me as a byproduct of the reparations movement. In 2001, there was insurance passed by the California state legislature that said that financial institutions have to disclose their historic relationship to the slave trade. And this is part of the reparations movement in an effort to identify sort of the paper trail, which companies have benefited from the legacy of slavery. It's worth noting that that legislation was modeled on legislation for the Holocaust insurance, Holocaust era insurance project, where descendants of those who have been interred or executed during the Holocaust noted that the value of life insurance policies had been taken as well. And there was an effort to identify which policies have been taken and to force insurance companies to pay the descendants of people in the Holocaust for the value of those policies. And even when insurance companies had paid someone else for the value of those policies stolen, they were forced to pay the descendants the value of that policy. What's interesting is that with the slavery insurance project, there was no effort to achieve redress. It was merely understood as a kind of educational project. And I think when the question of sort of redress around slavery and reparations comes up, people often suggest that, well, we don't have a paper trail. We cannot identify the descendants of these enslaved people. And I think of the Treasury of Weary Souls project as an effort to help us establish the kind of accounting we need to identify this paper trail and to figure out who the descendants are, but also to figure out who is liable for these injuries, because establishing liability is key to achieving redress when it comes to the question of slavery and slavery reparations. So I basically want to orient my comments toward having us think through this question of liability, or if my fellow panelists have talked about the sort of legal, historical, and practical parameters of reparations, I want to think about the actuarial dimension of reparations, how we might think of that. I also want to note that at least one woman has been able to trace her ancestry to records in this archive. It so happened that some of the coal miners working in Virginia had built a church, and because they had built a church, they, as founders of the church, kind of were in this different archive related to the church, and some of the founders' names are also some of the same last names as enslaved people in this record we have of enslaved people who are insured. And so it's possible to demonstrate that the descendants of the people who built this church, who are also some of the same people who were these enslaved people who are insured, are still alive today and could potentially sue to recover the value of the policies in which their ancestors were trafficked. And so I think I want to encourage us to kind of think about, creative ways to use accounting to establish this paper trail that many people think does not exist. It's very common by now for people of African descent to use sites like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, to understand more about their lineage and ancestry, to figure out their relationship to the transatlantic slave trade. If that's possible, I sometimes wonder to myself if it's possible for us to input the tax records over time of people whose families held enslaved people or insured or bought and sold enslaved people. If there was a kind of financial version of 23andMe, would it then be possible to kind of trace out this paper trail and sort of, in concrete terms, use forensic accounting to see who has benefited from the legacy of slavery and thus who might be implicated in this question of reparations? So what I want to suggest is that the key to understanding how we might achieve reparations is to think of it in the most practical sense as an incident in which there is an injury and in which we can establish who is liable and who the victim is. And so once we have the injury, we have the victim, we have who is liable, then we decide how much is owed and who owes what to whom. And, you know, it's often the case with something like the transatlantic slave trade, which went on for hundreds of years, which has sort of untold victims and scale of injury that is practically impossible to quantify. People will sort of wonder what it means to even attempt to put a dollar amount on it. But I think that, you know, you could say that about any moment in which we assess monetary value to human life. You know, every day, the event as simple as a car accident, when there's an injury or loss of life, we calculate, you know, the amount of time the person will be injured, what missed wages might be from work or missed salary from work. If, God forbid, there's a loss of life, we use sort of family medical history and risk factors, projected future wages to decide how to quantify that loss of life, and that amount is delivered to the family. And what I think is important about just how commonplace this activity is of assessing the value of life and securing redress is that it does not rely on people to believe in this to execute this, right? Like, you may not believe that it's possible to put a dollar value on a family member's life, and yet if that person were to pass away and you're the next of kin, you will receive a check once that injury is adjudicated. So I think it's worth considering what it means to think of it just as a structural feature of governance and not merely rely on whether or not people think other people are deserving of redress. So if you think of this as a simple as a car accident or as a war crime or other kind of event, it becomes much easier, I think, to think about the practical implications of it. Of course, there's still a question of, like, who are the victims? And as I open with a land acknowledgement, clearly we're dealing with sort of several demographics who've been injured through the transatlantic slave trade, right? There's people whose lands were taken. There's multiple waves of immigration. There's multiple waves of people brought, you know, to the U.S. in chains. How do we quantify this? There are various people who've thought about, okay, someone who's descendant in the U.S. specifically, for instance, someone who's identified as Black for a certain amount of time. And I think all these are worth contemplating, these criteria. I also think that it's possible to have multiple criteria in operation such that we can imagine certain groups are deserving of a certain kind of redress given this kind of experience, and other groups are deserving of other kinds of redress given this other kind of experience. It's not as if these forms of redress are mutually exclusive. It could be that we have a kind of formula for who is deserving of what kind of reparations. And along those lines, I sort of want to close with an example that might encourage us to think about just how we can think of different kinds of injury as being connected to other kinds, and even how this question of reparations is not merely for people of African descent, descendants of enslavement, but also for other kinds of injury for which the U.S. government is arguably liable. So I guess the last example I'll give is to return us to the 2008 financial crisis. And, you know, my thinking on this has been influenced by Bob Meister, the political theorist. But in conversation, we've talked about the fact that at the dawn of the emergency, the Economic Emergency Stabilization Act of 2008, or what's called the bailout, popular opinion was against the bailout. So most Americans did not agree with the bailout. And so from that perspective, you could argue that the bailout was coercive or even unlawful in the sense that an amount of money was taken from taxpayers and used to bail out corporations against their will. Now, if we were to believe that that was unlawful, and if people were to seek redress for the bailout, the question would be, well, how do you establish who's in the class that's affected, right? Like, if this is a class action lawsuit of some kind, there has to be an injured class. So we could contemplate that the injured class would be all the taxpayers from that year, 2008. And it could be that the value of the bailout is essentially the US GDP, because that's the collateral for the amount of money given to Wall Street. And the GDP for that year, by one calculation, is as much as $14 trillion. And there were 185 million taxpayers in 2008. So if you divide 14.7 trillion by 185 million, you come up with a figure that's close to $80,000. So that would be something like each taxpayer is owed $80,000 if in fact we think of the bailout as unlawful. And that $80,000 check to each taxpayer would be essentially like a stimulus, which many people were calling for anyway, instead of bailing out Wall Street. So even alongside this question of reparations for descendants of slavery, we could think of reparations for victims of the 2008 bailout, or reparations for various kinds of injustice. And what it might mean is not merely that people are cut a check or given a certain amount of money. It could be that people are given an account and they can draw down on that account for healthcare, college tuition, other kinds of benefits. And that essentially what it means is the government is beholden to people through this redress for support for social services or various kinds of access to crucial social institutions. Whatever the case, I just want to note that this idea of reparations is of crucial significance to the extent that we can all agree that the transatlantic slave trade and various other events constitute a kind of atrocity and a kind of injury. We should also be able to agree that the victims of those injuries are deserving of redress, and the rest, the specific protocol for establishing redress is actually rather commonplace and something we do all the time. Thank you for your time.
I believe I'm up next. So I want to thank all the panelists. Also, I'm aware that we have very little time left, especially when we have questions. Unfortunately, I have to teach also shortly in a little bit.
Don, please feel free to take the 12 minutes, to go to 2 o'clock if you can.
Okay. Also, I'll apologize beforehand, although it may not be necessary, but I said early on, I just got my second Pfizer shot, and I'm having slight reactions, but they're not significant. But if they change, I'll let you know. So first of all, I think this is a really important question. I also think it's a really complicated question and a simple question all at the same time. A number of panelists have said reparations might mean money, it might not mean money. I think it's hard to actually ground this question until we actually have a sense of what it is we're trying to achieve. What's the goal and purpose of reparation? And what are we trying to achieve? And who would be the recipients? And then the what and how. And that's something I can't really do in 12 minutes, and I think a number of panelists have spoken to it. But I'll at least sort of try to raise some questions that I think we have to answer. And I'll use as a foil my friend Sandy Darity, who's written a lot on reparation. He has what I would call a narrow perspective of reparation. He's aware of that. He's saying reparation should be cash payments, and it's for the injury of slavery, of enslaving people of African descent. And the who should get it is at least one parent was a former ancestor was a former slave, and the what and how should be a cash payment. He acknowledges that that's a limited approach. He acknowledges that the other approach. He also acknowledged, like Michael and others, that there are other groups who might have legitimate claims, depending on how we talk about legitimate. Certainly, there have been injuries to other groups, Native Americans, Chinese Americans. There's already been a modest payment to Japanese Americans. But whether or not we want to sort of follow the same template is questionable. So what is the goal of reparation? So one would be, in a sense, backwards looking. There's an injury, a set of injuries that happened, and they didn't happen a long time ago, like a lot of people think. I'm thinking of Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name, which suggests that slavery in some form was actually operating in the United States until the 1940s. And then you look at people like Michelle Alexander who say that, okay, we shifted from some formalized slavery to a different kind of slavery or caste, so that in a sense, the underlying performance of hyper exploitation of a people in part based on race continues. And I think this is part of what Jovan was speaking to. It's not just what happened a long time ago, but then Jovan complicated the issue some. He's saying it's not just a US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. So then do we have a global response, which actually complicates it substantially, especially if we think in terms of the United States, although one could argue that the United States is not just a nation state, it's actually global imperialist, and this economy reflects that. But that just sort of speaks to some of the complexities that some of the practices are still going on. So clearly there's been a set of injuries. It's not as clear who are the perpetrators of those injuries, who benefited from those injuries, and maybe therefore who should pay. And I guess I would actually at least interrogate the issue of white people being the perpetrators of the injury. And I know that's sort of a popular stance, but let me just give you one example. If you look at the racial wealth gap, which is one of the things that Darity looks at, he says that should be a target to eliminate the racial wealth gap. By some accounts, and there's different data points on this, the racial wealth gap between white people at 50% of the median income for whites and blacks at that same median income is about 3%. Are we really saying that if we pay blacks at the lower 50%, increase their wealth by 50%, we've resolved something? We've actually paid reparation? I think not. If we look at it in aggregate instead of disaggregating, we see the racial wealth gap is huge, 10-1, but it's not whites in the lower 50%, and not even whites in the lower 70%. It's the elites. Well, now we're talking about something else. We're not talking about white people writ large. We're talking about something else. Wealth is just one indicator. People might say, well, there are other indicators like how you're treated by the police, where you go to school. And I think that's all reasonable to sort of factor in. But it sort of shows in terms of the way we talk about it sometimes, I think, creates a binary that's not always helpful. And if we could close the racial wealth gap, let's say between the bottom 50% percentile, blacks would not be that much better off, nor would whites. And so I want to posit that we actually want something else. We don't just want to close the racial wealth gap. And the racial wealth gap is not simply the enslavement of black people and stealing of land, is actually doing something more than creating a racial wealth gap. Michael Olney and Howard Winnett in Racial Formation call racism and racialization the master category. And what do they mean by the master category? What they really mean by that, I think, is that the category of race and racism is used to structure every aspect of society. It helps us understand our relationship with religious minorities, with gays, with people with disabilities. If that's true, if that's accurate, then should those groups have a claim through that category? Or should the category be exclusive to people who are direct descendants of slaves? Again, Darity doesn't reject that. In fact, he acknowledges that. But he says each group should actually make its own claim. I think that that's politically fraught. I think that if those claims are legitimate, if we acknowledge them as potentially legitimate, but then say we're going to defer their claim until some other time, we're essentially creating what we call breaking. We're creating division between groups. We're creating, and we're missing, in a sense, the kind of power dynamics that would be necessary to make this real. But let me give you what I think of as another problem. And I don't want to make it too heavy of a problem because, as a number of speakers have said, we've already paid reparations. I mean, if you think about it, the first successful slave revolt, you could say, in the New World was Haiti, when Haiti revolted against France and eventually won. But part of the peace treaty with France required them to pay reparations to France until the 1950s. So clearly, the world didn't have trouble paying reparations, in a sense, to either the enslaving state or the slave holders. And the irony and craziness of that, it's just hard to wrap your minds around. That people fight for their freedom and then have to pay because you enslave them. Anyway, and that's to 1950. So we're not talking about a long time ago. So we have a number of examples of paying reparations to the elites. So I don't want to make it too complicated. People didn't have to go through all these machinations to say, well, how would you do that? They did it, right? But having said that, I do want to suggest that what we're trying to achieve through reparations is not just a cash payment, which people have said. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So if we think of enslavement as actually creating a system, not just wealth, but a system that actually creates inequality, denigrates the lives of people, and so on, that system is in place. And I worry that if we pay people a cash allotment and didn't change the system would reproduce itself within one generation. And we have examples of that from South Africa, from Russia, and from other places where people got chunks of money, but the system didn't change. And within less than a generation, sometimes in a few years, all the money's gone, and the populations that's targeted for reparations in those societies are not better off. And so I'm concerned that unless we actually figure out a way to actually make the structure of America function very differently, just giving people money, even if it's $14 trillion, as Michael suggested, that might change some things, but I don't think we'll change everything. So I think we have to look at the structures and look at what we're really trying to achieve through reparation. And I'll end by just saying, I think part of that is we're trying to achieve, I think, some acknowledgement of the past. I don't want to just skip over that, but also a different kind of future. And what we oftentimes advocate is something called targeted universalism. That is, we're trying to get every group to a certain universal space or goal, and we use targeted strategies to do that. But the targeted universalism is actually something that actually reflects intervention for all groups, but recognizing groups are unevenly situated. So it doesn't say treat everybody the same. It says treat everybody how they're situated within society and structure. And the last thing I'll say is that the ultimate thing is that the people who are being affected not only get to decide about reparation, but get to decide about the entire country. That's the radical element of a democracy, is that we get to decide, that it really is we, the people, and we decide. And we don't just decide, it doesn't mean Black people decide for Black people. It means Black people decide for white people. It means white people decide for Black people. It means we decide together. It means we co-create, which is what, quote unquote, the founders did when they created a society. So I know I'm out of time, so I'll stop.
Thank you. My enormous thanks to all 5 of the speakers for their terrific presentations. We do have some questions, but I apologize, we're out of time. This is a conversation that obviously is going to go on, and it's going to go on in connection with the bill that Governor Newsom signed. It's going to go on society. Once more, my thanks to the Staff Circle on Anti-Racism, Thembi Ann Jackson, Jenny Boyden, and to all of you for coming. We had a very large live stream audience, as well as those on the Zoom, and I really appreciate everyone being a part of it. Thank you. Take care, everyone.